Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special episode, perhaps we'll call this. I want to take a moment and do contemplation, reflection upon the work of Cormac McCarthy. He died, I think, just less than a year ago, or maybe just at a year ago. And he's considered broadly to be one of the great writers, and probably is one of the great writers in recent American history. And so I thought it was worth reflecting on him because I think he does reveal a lot about the American mindset. And because I've been pondering doing a series about American culture and philosophical history, his name kept floating to the top of my mind. And I thought it was worth doing a reflection on him because I think he does articulate things. However, I think what the reception of his works have been is generally misleading and inaccurate. So I do not want to imply in any way that he's not a great author. I mean, look at what he's accomplished. Basically, anything you can accomplish with literature, he's accomplished. But it is, I think, the reason he's held to be great is often misleading and unhelpful and disguises what is the true power of his writing and why he has resonated with so many people so powerfully with his work. And so, but if you're not familiar with Cormac McCarthy, 1933 to 2023, so he lived, I guess, exactly 90 years. And he was not very well known till later in his life, and he lived a pretty minimalist life and wrote a fair amount. So anything I do say about his works, you'll be able to find, exceptions here and there, which I'll try to point out in some major instances. But, in such a broad opus of material, there will be, exceptions. However, I'll try to talk about what I think is the core nature. And people like Harold Bloom, considered him one of the great novelists of the 20th century America, like I said, Pulitzer Prize, American Book Award. I mean, if it was a literary prize, I think he's won it. Films, sort of, again, pretty much what you could accomplish. But again, I think his reception is what sort of bothers me and what I think is worth reflecting on. And so consider this like a prologue to my series on America and American culture and society and philosophy that sort of underwrites the American worldview to the extent that it can be a single thing. And so I want to articulate what I think are the main features of his writing and talk about why they're that way, what that means, and then go into each of those in depth. However, first I want to start with this notion of what the reception is. So if you read articles, and I got a bunch of quotes and I decided that won't waste your time because it's easy enough to look up and read reviews of his material and read people writing about the impact he's had. What you consistently get is this notion that he has captured an American reality or the American world or the American West, or he's captured the history of the American West, or he's captured the reality of the existence of man, and there's this very strong and repetitive insistence that he's captured some part of the reality of the world, and particularly the American world, and even more particularly the American West, and particularly historically the American West. And fundamentally, I just think this is inaccurate, and I think it misses what is important about McCarthy and what his work tells us about insights into the American outlook and worldview. So, what distinguishes his writing overall? And I think there's 6 key elements, and I'll just enumerate them, and then we'll go through them one at a time. And first, what you'll see consistently throughout his works is nature is primarily a barren wasteland, and it's cruel and empty and ugly and dangerous. This is sort of the setting of many of his novels, Blood Meridian, the trilogy, The Road, of course, famously, which I'll talk about. Individuals are largely isolated. Even when they're in groups, the way he writes, the way he presents the narrative focus, people are generally isolated. And then even, so for instance, like in Blood Meridian, again, where the main character is in a gang off and on, but even then there's a huge sense of isolation, and the gang itself is isolated. So there's not a lot of community, very little time spent in cities, if to the extent that they are. This tends to be very negative as well. No real developed sense of history and past and culture, and no real sense of future development. And and again, generational community kinds of things. And so, it's the isolated individual which forms the core of his work. None of this is controversial, by the way. I think you just look up any review of his work and you'll see this. Physically violent, so lots of violence, lots of torture and death and mutilation and rapes and killings, brutality, physical brutality form a core of his work. The characters tend to be, with the exception, potentially arguable exception of Judge Holden as a major character in one of the works, they tend to be uneducated, not highly reflective, parochial in their outlooks, provincial in their views and outlook, and very isolated. Again, it's part of the isolation of the individual. It's not just isolated from physical community, but for intellectual community of the past or these sorts of things. So it's pretty rare that you'll encounter cultural institutions or articulate individuals. Again, Judge Holden being an exception, although a terrifying one. So that's 4. 5 is overwhelmingly masculine. I was trying to do a rough calculation of the works I've read, but I haven't read everything. So I've read his major works and gone through other ones. But overwhelmingly masculine does not capture this sense. I think if you took all of the words spoken in all of his novels by women, could you fill 10 pages? Are there 10 pages of spoken lines by women? If there are, it's not a lot more than that. So you can go for dozens, hundreds of pages and neither encounter women, or if you do, they're usually victims, or they're inarticulate, they don't speak. If they speak, they have 1 or 2 lines. I mean, it's just incredibly narrow in most of them. There are exceptions, of course, all the pretty horses. There's a character who speaks, but even then you get just women. If you told the total number of pages of his works, I mean, they're going to be 97% actions, thoughts, speeches by men, to men, with men, or people on their own. So it's like women are just gone. And then they're ahistorical. Now this would be the first one that would be controversial, by the way, but I don't see why it's controversial, because there's this notion that he's setting these works in the West, and he is vaguely setting them in the West, so it's sort of this metaphysical, phantasmagorical West, and there are some theoretically historical elements and characters, sort of, but it's not a real history. These are not historical in any meaningful sense, and they're just more fantastic than that. And I'll give you many examples of that. So I think one of the things is that they're massively ahistorical, by the way, which also makes them seemingly apolitical, which will be an important theme that comes up as we move forward. And so again, I think with the notion of 6, I think that is the only one that might be slightly controversial, but really I don't think it's that controversial. They're really not historical novels at all. So 1, why does this matter? So nature is a barren wasteland. This comes up again and again. The road, of course, is just like it's this wasteland. And what's interesting about this, again, this is played against the reception. If you read all the quotes about the people, about how great he is, talking about he's captured the reality of the West, he's captured the reality of the mindset, he's captured this element that people overlook, and the world, this is how the world is, right? There's this fundamental claim that somehow he's captured, this is how the world is, particularly America, and particularly the American West. And again, this notion is that nature is a barren wasteland. It's cruel, it's empty, it's noxious, it's dangerous. Bad things happen to you. You'll get attacked by Indians. Comanches will kill you. The roads will catch on fire. Cannibals will try and eat you. Just nothing good is going to happen out there. And what's interesting about this is if you look at a painter like O'Keeffe, now Georgia O'Keeffe was painting the landscapes that in theory Cormac McCarthy is describing. And you don't think of her as being a romantic. She doesn't flinch away from the desert landscapes that she's painting in the Southwest and out there. And she's got the skull, so it's not that she's afraid of meditating on death and presenting it quite clearly and dramatically. but it's also consistently beautiful. If you look at Native American descriptions and considerations and some of the poetry that has come down to us orally from the tribes that were in that region, they did not think of it as a dangerous wasteland. They thought of it as a rich paradise. If you look at the Mexican history of these areas, for instance, Blood Meridian is set in the Texas secession zone as it's becoming part of America. They were fighting for it not because there was nothing there, but because they had ideas that it could be rich at least. And so it was a forbidding landscape. It was a dangerous landscape in some ways, but it not necessarily barren and cruel, indifferent. Of course, nature always indifferent, but also, again, in the paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe, quite beautiful. And one of the odd things you'll find is that the author that's most commonly compared to Cormac McCarthy, or that Cormac McCarthy is most often compared with, is Melville. And they say, well, Melville, put his characters out in cruel nature, and et cetera, et cetera. And if you read Melville, this is not Melville's nature at all. As I was reading these reviews, this is what kind of got me going, is if you read Moby Dick, or Bartleby the Scrivener, or one of his other works, it's not nature that's the problem in these works, right? It's nature is there, nature often beautiful, amazing, intemperate, overwhelming, but it's not a wasteland. It's not emptiness, and there's this, the glowing Pacific Sea that they sail on endlessly, is filled with visions and images and sharks and whales and birds and all of this overwhelming life. And then, of course, the deep philosophical meditations that everybody does when they're out on the whaling ship. And so this notion that this is really nature is bizarre, because you can look at people who are painting that landscape or writing that he's compared to, and they don't have this sense of nature at all. Or look at someone like Whitman's Leaves of Grass, famous, who was living in the era that several of McCormick's major novels are set. He didn't have this view of nature at all. I mean, even Whitman was nuts, but this was not his. He was out in nature, and he just thought it was amazing, like everything else he thought was amazing. And so if you look at even something like The Road, which is clearly in no way realistic, there's a passage where they say, the father says to the son, there's no birds, and there's never going to be any birds. And it's a bizarre world. Like, why wouldn't there ever be any birds? And the idea is there's been some sort of horrible catastrophe that's beset the world, and then so there's no birds. But it's hard to calculate out what would happen for there to be no birds, right? Like it's a weird. It's not a natural presentation, right? It's not a reflection on nature. It's a reflection on other things, which we'll talk about, but not necessarily nature. So you look at, again, many other painters besides O'Keeffe have painted the Southwest and the West, and often they're quite beautiful. John Muir is out here taking pictures of this, and they can be stark, they can be majestically empty, but this threatening, cruel, empty wasteland is not necessarily the case. And then the notion that we are individuals and isolated and alone, and that there's nothing, no community, no past, no future, that this is the thing. Again, if you compare him to Melville, which is most likely or most commonly done, Melville's got a ship full of people, right? It's one of the oddest things. That's why I couldn't figure. I mean, it just kind of drove me mad. I'm like, why are they keep comparing him to Melville? Because in Melville's most famous work, quite literally, it's a community. One of the big subjects of Melville is this sense of community, of being together with people, of pursuing a common goal, of accomplishing things in a group that you cannot accomplish on your own, that it's better to be, the lowliest guy, who our narrator is, Call Me Ishmael. He's the lowliest guy on the boat. He's basically not getting paid. He's, but he's got his buddy Kukeg, and they're out doing something together, and this goes wrong, but there's also something great in that. So, and there's all these meditations on this. Starbuck famously has a meditation about this. There's all the consideration of this as they're loading the boat. about how the community cooperates, how the boat is loaded, what everybody's responsibilities are, what happens when you leave the shore. Yeah, it goes on and on, but it's a book that reflects on, perhaps at extreme length, over greater length, this notion of community, of a shared goal and mission, of people from very different, diverse walks of life working together. And then you can compare him to a novelist that he's never compared to, at least as far as I've been able to discover, so I'll break some new literary critical ground here for you, is Henry James. And the funny thing is, Henry James grew up and lived in the era that Cormac McCarthy is theoretically writing about. However, the world, of course, that James presents is essentially diametrically opposed. It is a world of community, of individuals talking together, of culture, of history, of future. I mean, it is the opposite of isolated individuals. And so, yeah, again, this notion that this isn't necessarily say how the world was then or how it is now, it just doesn't hold up with most of the comparisons. And interestingly, you can even look at someone like T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland. By the way, rarely does Eliot come up, which I was a little surprised at, but then of course not surprised, because even though Eliot wrote, a big work plus many others that have the wasteland, isolation of individuals as a theme, but these are individuals isolated within culture, right? This is the wasteland. The wasteland is not a physical, material, natural wasteland. It's an internal wasteland that he's exploring within the context of culture and other people, right? In the room, the women come and go. Speaking of Michelangelo, so this is just just this notion of the isolated, lone individual. And then the physical violence, right? And so this is one of those ideas of the American West. And it's not to say that there was no violence in the American West. Of course there was. But that there was this just random pain and suffering and pointless and undirected. And again, of course, there is going to be always is some sort of random chaotic violence in the world, but much more of the violence in the American West, particularly if you look at something like the secession of Texas, was a historical political violence. It was directed towards excising estates, stealing land, going to war with Mexico. I mean, the violence was there, and that created lots of spin-off violence. But the notion that this was all just random and had no point and was meaningless is, again, this is a historical, which we'll get to, but that endless emphasis on and repetitious presentation of brutality and the notion that this is the necessary natural order of things. Again, like Melville does not have this, even though there is a fair bit of this in Moby Dick. But it's not, again, it's not directed and pointless. I mean, it's very pointed. There's a white whale out there, and the killing of the whales and the killing of the sharks to become the whales in this one famous passage in Melville presents specifically this, like, what is happening? What is nature doing? Why are we doing this, right? And the characters actually meditate upon this. It's not something that just comes out of nowhere and goes away. The white whale doesn't come out of nowhere and go away. It takes an entire novel to get there. It's the opposite of random or pointless or meaningless violence. It's very meaningful, very pointed, and debate about what it does mean. But of course, Melville had meditated on this for the length of the book. And then you get this point of all these largely inarticulate, rarely educated, very little conversation, often long silences, obtuse, very little internal world is explored, which is odd for novels, right? I think one of his breakthroughs away is this surface novel, like it's sort of the opposite of what people had been doing. It's an interesting, stylistically powerful writer, because he can carry this off, which is no mean trick, by the way. I mean, it's not that it's a trick. It's not some sort of cheap trick that he's doing. It's amazing that he can stylistically write at a level for such a length of time that keeps you involved, despite the fact that much of the time you're just on the surface of these things. You don't get to see behind the curtain, as it were, which is often what the novels hang upon. And so he sort of was able to do this. And so he was able, somewhat Hemingway-esque, but Hemingway worked in, I would say, in a slightly different vein, to present these uneducated, inarticulate people and keep them there. But is this the nature of the world again? Again, if you look at Melville or James or Eliot, even their uneducated characters have things to say. Queequeg, if I'm saying that right, I never know how to pronounce the name of the character in Moby Dick. If he doesn't say a lot, but his actions are give you the notion that he has a robust and full inner life, that he is a deep character, that he has a philosophy, he has ideas. And that's one of the things that's fascinating about him. You're like, wow, look at this. He has values. He has an outlook. We get to see it develop. He is attached to Ishmael, our narrator, and it's fascinating and full in that sense. So, and of course, Ahab and Starbuck, have these famous speeches, and Ahab is surprisingly internal in his dialogues. So this comes up all the time. By the way, I should also mention Moby Dick is funny. So that's why there's irony in and maybe sarcasm in McCarthy. He's rarely funny, but Moby Dick is an absolutely drop-dead hilarious book. If you don't think it is, you need to reread it, because it is one of the funniest books ever written. It's just absolutely hilarious, but it's so subtle and so dry that we often miss it. But in McCarthy, there's very little humor. Like, humor is not a thing. It's a humorless world, if you will. And so these inarticulate characters who are, again, 95% of the time, conservatively speaking, masculine. Like, how can you have a world that's supposedly realistic in any way that is just men, or almost all men, and almost all, even again, when there are women, they rarely speak, and when they do, it's usually not a lot. And so again, it's what a strange world. And again, this is that fantasy American West, not the real American West, because there were women in the American West. That's how people were born in the West. And of course, Native American tribes had women, and the Mexican settlers in these lands had women. And, so it's just this idea that, there was this world where there were just manly men being manly men. This is just, it's nonsensical, it's ahistorical, it's not accurate. But this is not what he wrote about, which is and I don't mean this as a criticism, again, of McCormac. What I mean to say is that when he's presented as having captured some quintessential essence of America or of the American West, this is when I think we've gone really wrong. Because you can't capture a quintessential essence of any world if there aren't women in it, right? I mean, just sort of by definition, right? It makes no sense. Even when you're in worlds that are totally male-dominated, right? Let's just say, there's military before women were allowed in, or other places like that. It's not like women weren't a reference for those men, right? These were not men who didn't ever think about women, who didn't have wives and mothers and daughters and sisters, right? It's even if they were in periodic periods where they were isolated and set mostly primarily with men and had little access to women or encountered them, that does not mean women weren't in the world and they weren't informing their vision. Notice all the letters of soldiers home to their wives and girlfriends and families. I mean, this is not a rare phenomenon. This is an absolute phenomenon. And so this notion of this bizarre never land where women are just almost not present and almost don't figure is interesting. In fact, I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of the work, to tell you the truth, but it is certainly not in any way quintessentially representative of the world, because that's just silly. And then finally, the notion of them being ahistorical. And this turns out in different ways, but again, Blood Meridian is the one where they say, this gang that the main character joins is an actual historical gang. Yeah, there was a random killing spree gang on the loose at the time that McCormac sets his novel, but this is not a realistic novel. McCormac did not claim it was a realistic novel. By the way, McCormac did not say he was writing a historical novel. He was inspired, like Melville was inspired by a whale that attacked a boat. and then you get Moby Dick. Moby Dick is not a documentary, right? This is Blood Meridian is not a documentary. These are not supposed to be realistic. And part of the fact that the reason the individuals are so isolated is because they are ahistorical. They are within no historical context. There's no superstructure of politics and culture and continuity of action that makes the greater world coherent, which is, again, part of what McCormack's doing. So, again, not a criticism of McCormack, a criticism of the reception of McCormack. Because, this fantasy world where there is no history, where there are no politics, where there aren't greater forces, cultural forces at work around us, right? Like you're in these, just random patches where anything can happen at any time because there are no coordinating culture forces. And this reaches kind of this apotheosis. I can't even say it today. Apotheosis. It's peak. We'll just go with peak in the road, where there's been some sort of catastrophe that's killed basically everybody, and the people who've left have, for no apparent reason, reverted to cannibalism and slavery and brutality. It's not clear why. And there's no possible, and McCarthy said it was not an actual, he did not work out what this catastrophe was, right? He never said that it was a nuclear war or anything like this. And if you read the book, you'll realize that there is no catastrophe that would produce this. Again, what would kill all the birds and make roads hot and cause forest fires periodically to appear for no apparent reason. And, you just go on and on. You're like, yeah, none of this makes any sense. There's not a sensible, realistic, it's not like a post-apocalyptic nuclear war story, in which case you could go, oh, there would be radioactive poisoning and all this stuff would happen. And, lots of these have been written, and you can follow the logic of it and maybe the science a bit of what this might mean, sort of carried out. He's not writing those works. This is not what he's doing. And that's part of the power of his works, what makes them so sort of gripping, is because it doesn't have that. You can't really get a hold on any of these elements because they are functionally ahistorical. And so famously at the end of now I don't want to get them confused. I think it's the end of Blood Meridian. There's a character who's digging post holes for no apparent reason that are filled with fire, or they light up with fire when he digs the holes. And you're just going, okay, great image, beautiful image. I'm not criticizing, but it's not, this is not realism. It's maybe demonically magical realism, sort of maybe more in the Garcia Marquez line. But so when people talk about him writing historical novels, he's writing a historical novel the way 100 Years of Solitude is a historical novel in a village filled with people who never die, right? Is that a historical novel? It's something, it's great, but I don't know if you would accuse him in that work of doing that. So those elements, again, that nature is a wasteland, individuals are largely almost totally isolated, random physical violence, pain and suffering and cruelty dominate. Characters, with a few notable exceptions, tend to be completely inarticulate and uneducated. There's no women practically, with, again, one exception I can think of, where there's a potential marriage, and ahistorical, apolitical. And so you add all this up, and again, you can look at the other writers of the times who are writing then or writing about those times, like Eliot James, Melville, Miller, for instance, Henry Miller. They don't do this. And so are they not capturing some aspect of reality? Have they completely lost? I don't think so. I think each of them in different ways captures different things. But this consistent emphasis on the notion that McCarthy has captured, again, some quintessential reality of the American experience, of the American West, of the American culture, is bizarrely wrongheaded. So what has he done? And this is where I think you can really get insight, and why I think of this as a prologue to pondering American culture, society, and philosophy. is that one, he's clearly, I don't even think this is, I don't know, people don't say this about him, and I don't know why, because they want to hold on to this reality. He's clearly writing in this mythopoetic vein. I mean, he's not writing realism. He's writing sort of Old Testament prophet in the wilderness stuff. He's writing visionary works. These are dreamlike, and this is where the power comes from. The fact that he's created a language and style, and he's very varied. Doesn't have like one style, which is part of the amazing. He can play on a lot of stops, but he has this ability to create this dreamlike sense, this visionary sense of something that's powerful and moving and resonant. And what is both telling and sort of shocking and maybe horrifying about this is the materialistic view of the American, the notion of the American worldview does not want to turn that inside. If you say something's mythopoetic, it's like a criticism, right? We're like, oh, it would be demeaning McCarthy's work to say that this isn't realistic, he really doesn't have the core of reality. It's like, no, he's got something, I think, more powerful, something that literature is better suited to do, which is to create and capture this mythopoetic sensibility of not the world, but how many people feel about the world. And these are completely different things. And that's what I think is important. And that's the distinction I want to make. The power of his writing is that somehow he's captured this sense of bleakness, of wasteland, of isolation, of violence, of inarticulateness, of ahistoricity that inhabit many, many people in the United States. So many people that when this mythopoetic figure is thrown up and can write powerfully, it resonates not because it's the external world, not because it has anything to do with what's going on out there. Of course, it has something to do, but he's articulating how people feel about that. When people look at the American West or the desert or nature, do they see Georgia O'Keeffe beauty? Do they see Ansel Adams photographs? Do they see, the purple desert? Or do they see McCarthy's, right? Do they go, oh, right, this is that, is it White Wolf? Is it this nature that's going to kill us, going to dominate us? And of course, there's all these movies and all stuff about, surviving in nature, struggling, dying in nature, like all of these things. Like, is that what nature is about? I'm not convinced, but there's certainly this mythopoetic vein that holds it that way. And I just went on a visit to Croatia and was visiting lands that remind me of the Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, nature is certainly a challenge and it's certainly threatening, but it's also beautiful and rich and overwhelming and full. And when he gets home, when Odysseus returns home, he goes to the garden, he goes to the rich soil and visits his father, and all the fruit is on the trees and the grapes are on the vines and the olives are there. And you're just like, wow, like this is superabundance. That's the magic, right? That this he's gone through this, again, mythopoetic adventure, but the end is not isolation and death and cruelty and misery. It is richness, culture, community, and reestablishing the order of quote-unquote civilization, although the ending is not that civilized. But, that the tenor is so completely different of the way to think about it. So the question is not, is nature this way? It's like, why would we perceive it? Why would the mythopoetic language that McCormac uses so resonate with people? Why this notion of isolation, right? The continuous return to the American West, the visions in our Western so often of the single person on the horse riding off into the sunset, right? It's the ultimate cliche, and yet, right, the lone strong man on his own who takes care of business, again, usually with physical violence, right? This is a trope that is so hopelessly embedded in American culture. It's just embarrassing. It's not necessarily the case, but it's not like, we have a sufficiently violent culture, that's for sure, but there's no evidence that this is the way culture is or has to be or needs to be. But it's this recurrent theme that, again, McCarthy captures the internal sensibility, the dreamlike nature. It's like, oh, he's articulated these people's perceptions and sensibility of the world, and that makes them think for some reason he's writing not about their internal world, which he is, or capturing, but about the actual world, which of course he's not, and really he doesn't ever claim to, or really he mostly claims like, look, I'm not writing about real historical events, I'm not writing about actual catastrophes, these are, he's like, these are this bizarre mythopoetic lands that he's operating in. And then the ahistoricity part about this is this notion of that we don't want to have this. If you have history, then you can have culture. If you have culture, you can have community. If you have community, you can't have isolated individuals. Articulateness education gets in the way of physical violence, again, with the exception of Judge Holden, who's sort of totally off the other edge. And there you get an almost Colonel Kurtz figure, where if you get too educated, right, then you become this, amoral serial killer and torturer of people. And that theme would mean, I guess it would mean that Henry James should have been, locked up early, because he was definitely a threat to Western civilization, because he should have been so terrifying. But the notion that education and reflection and knowledge might be civilizing and might be calming and might lead to a past, a present, and a future, or a culture that one could participate in, a community that one could build. All of that is denied, right? Like this is full stop denied. And so what McCarthy creates is this whole series of interlinked works, not interlinked in the sense of they all add up together to make one story, but they do add up to sort of build this consistent worldview that is the stark, isolated individual at war and subject to random violence and destruction at any moment for no reason, because there is no meaning that's perceptible in the world. And so it has this bizarre kind of a nativist, isolationist nihilism in there. And again, that it with the mythopoetic language that goes along with that. And so again, like I said, the apotheosis, that was the word I was trying to say, in the road, where basically nobody speaks, only horrible things happen. And it's just this, and it is senseless and pointless, and you never know why anything is happening or what's happening. It really has this sustained nightmare quality that is horror show. But again, the question is, why would that horror show resonate so strongly and so powerfully that people would say, oh, this captures something that makes him one of the great writers, American writers of the last whatever century, and stripping away all of these trappings. And what he exposes, and why I think he's important, is that really this is, a lot of people do feel this way. A lot of people do have this sort of sensibility. And that, I think, is what's both powerful about him, but also terrifying, right? Because it's like, wow, this capturing, is the world really this way? Like I said, there's lots of writers who have written, who lived through these times and who wrote about these times, who had nothing, they did not share this sort of vision. And again, O'Keeffe, look at a bunch of O'Keeffe paintings, and then read some of Cormac novels set in the same, sort of geography and geology. And I mean, are these the same worlds? I would much rather live in O'Keeffe's world. Let me put it to that way. But somehow that is not articulated. It's not like, oh, McCarthy has captured a sickness, we need a cure. It's like, no, he's captured reality. And that's just the way things are. There's nothing that can be done about this. And this is the final element, I think, in these stories that's so both disturbing and dreamlike, is there is this almost complete sense of individual efficacy. Right, the individuals do things and they suffer and they struggle, but nothing works. They can't accomplish it. Right, it's this they're completely disarmed, and random shit happens, and the individual who is isolated and alone really just can't do anything. And so there's this bizarre mix of threat and powerlessness, of cruelty and smallness and inability to deal with it. There, of you can't even articulate it. And so that kind of element is externalized again. So if you read Eliot's The Wasteland, which I recommend to everybody because it's amazing, and you would think it's named The Wasteland, so you'd think people would talk about it when they talk about Cormac McCarthy, but one, we tend to denigrate poetry, even though in the hands of great poets, what could be better? And in The Wasteland, what's clear is it is Eliot's wasteland, right? I mean, it's the clear, April is the cruelest month because it stirs up those emotions inside of you, right? You're the problem. You're the frozen one. You're the one who's been burying things. At the end when he's asking for peace, passe, right? Water in the desert, just some water, right? All this stuff is clearly that it's his problem. And that we don't like that burden. That burden is now shifted onto me. So if I feel like Eliot also tells me that this is my problem. I mean, culture is a problem, community is a problem, all this stuff is a problem, but it's really my problem. And by the way, he's super articulate, incredibly literate, and definitely historical. I mean, he includes all of literature in his work, so it's overwhelmingly literate, if you will. But the burden is on you. It's clearly a self-criticism and by extension, a criticism of ourselves. Whereas McCormac and the reception of McCormac has translated it into this nightmare mythopoetic world that is presented as reality. Nothing to do with you. Of course you feel this way, because this is just how the world is. Of course this is the thing. The world is this way, and of course there's nothing you can do about it, because you have no efficacy, right? And so it's this strange mix of overwhelming physical violence that's pointless, of struggle that goes nowhere, of attempts for achievement that are almost always thwarted, and yet some sense that, and there's nothing to do about it. This isn't you, this is the world. And so while they're both wastelands, Eliot's is vastly different, and I think vastly more powerful and insightful for that. But what McCormac does, and why he's been so well received, and what I think the power is that people should respond to and ponder, is he does resonate this internal wasteland. But then they externalize it. By the way, the critics almost universally, for a few exceptions, almost universally, and don't take my word for it, read around, look at the reception of his works. And then you'll discover wow, that's kind of terrifying. Not the notion that you feel this way, but the notion that you feel this way because you're right. Eliot doesn't make you feel right. McCormac makes you feel like, you feel this way because this is the way it is. And so when someone is lauded as being this incredibly great author, which I think he is, by the way, so again, not a criticism, and what he's captured is a sensibility that is the world is a barren wasteland and cruel. Individuals are isolated. There is no community. Physical violence is random and suffering is to be expected, and there's nothing you can do about it. Inarticulateness and uneducatedness is the way the world is. That's the way you should be. Women don't exist, apparently. The whole feminine world has nothing, is not there. There is no history. There are no politics. There is no culture. And that's really the way the world is. And everything else is a myth. So that's the lever it pulls, the final trick, or not the final trick, but the last trick I'll point out, is then what it tells you from there. Once you've gotten to that place, you're like, well, this is how the world is. Then when you see a Henry James, right? No one reads Henry James anymore. I think because of the McCormac, what I call the McCormac McCarthy worldview, is like, this is just nonsense. Like his world of people who are reflexive of culture, of community, of a broader world. James is always reflecting on the globe, like the encounters with Europe. How does Europe look at America? How does America look at Europe? How do these cultures mesh? How do they not mesh? Right, so it's not parochial, it's not provincial, it's historical, it's global, it's multilingual, it's educated, it's overeducated. If you want to criticize James, he's overeducated and they're overarticulate, and they spend too much time reflecting on themselves, right? This and their culture and their community around them. But boy, I love it. Of course, not unsurprisingly. And so, but what happens is, if McCarthy is right, if that mythopoetic vision is correct, then everything James has done is just nonsense. It's just worthless. Culture itself is pointless and worthless. Like it's a trick. Don't fall for it, right? It's there's nothing there. Community doesn't exist. You're an isolated individual. You're on your own. And so again, this is the terror I find in the power of McCarthy's writing. I think I'd be happier if he was a less good writer, but he's not a less good writer. He's a very great writer. And he delivers convincingly this utterly horrifying presentation of American mythopoetic sensibilities that has this power to negate beauty and culture and self-reflection and growth and efficacy and women and things that I'm generally in favor of. And so that is why I think it's important that an author like McCarthy is understood in a way that gives insight not just to his writing and his reception, but why it's so powerful, why he's considered so great in American culture, because it provides this powerful, I would say devastating and partly terrifying insight into American sensibilities, because that's what he's done. He's delivered that. He's resonated with people, and he's allowed them to say, yes, this bleak barrenness I felt inside is not me. I'm right, because this is how the world is. And that needs to be grasped if you're ever going to understand anything about the fundamental or part of the fundamental elements that underwrite American culture at large. So, Cormac McCarthy, again, not a criticism per se of his work, because it is powerful, it is amazing. Mythopoetic, not realistic, but even more powerful and perhaps more terrifying for that. Thank you very much.